Welcome to the Explainer. Today we're looking at something super fascinating, the evolution of site selection in the energy industry. Now think about this. The very first oil wells in history, back in the 1850s, weren't found with billion-dollar offshore seismic vessels or these massive engineering teams. They were found by simply watching where black liquid leaked out of the ground on its own. That's it.
It's kind of wild to think about, but before the massive high-tech exploration industry we know today even existed, this incredibly primitive method of basically just following the leak was the entire ballgame. If you wanted to find an underground reservoir in the 1850s, you literally just scoured the earth looking for puddles. That was the entirety of the exploration industry.
Okay, let's dive into this timeline. We're going to trace the historical journey of site selection technologies. From surface seeps in the 1850s to anticline mapping in the 1900s, seismic reflection in the 1920s, all the way up to modern 3D and 4D supercomputer modeling. And the best way to look at this progression is to realize that each era was essentially invented to solve the previous era's fatal flaw. Every single step forward was a necessary leap to overcome a massive, expensive blind spot.
Section 1, Finding the Dome Before the Rig.
So to understand why this technology had to evolve, we first need to define the absolute core job of site selection. The entire objective here is identifying, before spending a single dollar on a massive drilling rig, where underground rock structures are actually likely to trap hydrocarbons. Early on, methods relied heavily on mapping out these specific dome-shaped structures from the surface. Those dome shapes have a specific geological name, an anticline. Technically, it's a convex upfold in rock strata where a permeable reservoir is capped by an impermeable seal, forming a structural trap. I know, it's a bit of a mouthful, but this specific structural trap is exactly the geological target those early explorers were desperately searching for.
We can anchor this complex concept with a really simple visual. Just picture an upside-down bowl buried underground. As oil naturally migrates upward through porous rock, it eventually hits something it absolutely can't pass through, an impermeable cap layer, which is basically the underside of that bowl. Because it can't go any higher, the oil just pulls right there. Bam, that's your structural trap. And this brilliantly illustrates the primary conflict those early explorers faced. See, a very, very low proportion of petroleum and natural gas deposits actually seep all the way up to the surface. Because of this, early geologists were forced to scour the earth for rare, visible leakages. It made for an incredibly inefficient and difficult exploration process. They were essentially looking for a broken underground pipe by just hoping to stumble upon a puddle.
So, quick check. What happens to exploration success once we stop looking for surface seepage and modern seismic takes over? Well, it jumps dramatically. Surface methods only ever found the leftovers, the traps that were already broken and leaking to the surface. Modern seismic, on the other hand, allows us to locate massive, perfectly sealed traps that have absolutely zero visible surface expression, which, it turns out, is most of them. Which brings us to Section 2, the seismic solution. Because of that fatal flaw in surface mapping, the industry had to pivot, and pivot hard. We had to stop watching the ground and start finding a way to look right through it. And the foundational bridge to that future was actually an early physical paper drum machine. Back in 1855, El Palmier developed the very first seismograph, originally just to detect and record earthquakes. It was a purely scientific geological tool. But this exact device became the bridge that took us away from the 1850s seep hunters and pointed us straight toward the modern exploration industry. But here's the crazy part. It actually took decades for the industry to make the connection. It wasn't until 1921 that this basic earthquake seismology technology was finally applied to the petroleum industry. That was the year they first used it to send energy waves down into the earth, bounce them off those underground formations, and actually locate oil. It was a total game changer. Surface seeps definitely got us started, but as you can see, we eventually had to abandon watching the ground entirely, which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. We know we abandoned the surface because it only showed us the leaking leftovers. But if we can't look at the ground to see these invisible, deeply buried bowls of oil, how do we listen to it? How do we actually use sound to map the earth? Think on that, because that is exactly what we're going to unpack in part 2. Thanks for joining this explainer, and we'll see you next time.